The longest and most important fight in One Piece history has seemingly just ended. And finally, we can compare Luffy vs. Kaido, a battle that has been running for 50 chapters straight, to other great fights in the series. Is this the best fight we've ever had in One Piece? In certain aspects, I would definitely say yes, but there are two other fights that most believe contend for the top spot, which were Luffy vs. Lucci and Luffy vs. Katakuri. Those two battles really set the standard for these long, drawn-out, epic duels between Luffy and the Big Bad. And today I'm going to be rating all three fights across 5 categories to see how Luffy vs. Kaido stacks up. We are going to be evaluating based on dramatic flow, choreography, tone, creativity, and climax. Obviously, a lot of this will be subjective, but we can talk about objective aspects of these fights and how that influences my, and probably many others, subjective feelings about how they all stack up. And you all can let me know in the comments below what you think was best. But before we get into it, make sure to subscribe for more One Piece videos every week. So to start with, one of the most important aspects to a great fight, in my opinion, is the overall flow of the battle. Meaning how many dramatic twists and turns does it take? Because especially with long drawn out battles like against Lucci, Katakuri, and Kaido, this element is extremely important because the conflict needs to remain interesting across dozens of chapters. So in that regard, Luffy vs. Lucci I'd say is relatively straightforward. This fight was really just a heavyweight slugfest between two extremely evenly matched opponents from start to finish. Whereas against Katakuri and Kaido, we were kind of following along with Luffy on an uphill climb to reach the level of his opponent. Luffy and Lucci were just going blow for blow from the start. And the fight plays out how you would expect. They both start in base form, then after a bit Luffy goes Gear Second, Lucci goes Hybrid. This is what we naturally expected since Gear Second had already been revealed to us. Gear Third was a nice change of pace during the middle section of the fight, though most readers tend to agree that Gear Second is generally cooler, and ultimately it goes back to that same setup of Luffy in Gear Second going against Hybrid Lucci. I'd say the backdrop of the Buster Call with the battleships and the cannon fire added some nice late game intensity to the fight and was a good way to up the ante as the battle progressed, and of course the Usopp scene at the end was the perfect surprise piece to introduce at the climax, though I'll speak more on that later. But ultimately I'd say the Katakuri fight and the Kaido fight had a lot more twists and turns to keep us guessing. Against Katakuri, the fact that the fight was even happening was a huge surprise in the first place, and an extremely welcome one. Normally we know who Luffy is going to fight at the end of the arc well in advance, but Katakuri was really the hidden boss of Whole Cake Island, and it felt like out of nowhere we were suddenly locked into a surprise title fight between him and Luffy in the Mirror World. Just the sheer shock value of getting such an incredibly important matchup out of nowhere cannot be understated. So the fight was off to a really fresh start, and from there we had plenty of interesting developments like learning about Katakuri's true nature, then the realization that Luffy is actually going to attempt to learn Future Sight just like Katakuri, which I don't think anyone predicted, and then the entire Flampei incident, which solidified Katakuri as the first major antagonist that actually wanted an honorable match with Luffy, and really made this the first time there was a sort of mutual respect between Luffy and his opponent, giving the whole fight a very different feel than what we'd been used to. And finally, the cherry on top was Luffy showing another unexpected Gear 4th variation, Snake Man, which many still prefer to Bound Man. But even all of that cannot compare to the roller coaster of ups and downs that was Luffy vs. Kaido. First of all, just the reveal of Advanced Conqueror's Haki in general, probably the most important and most sacred ability in the entire series. Chapter 1010 was absolutely insane. But then cut to a few chapters later with Luffy having suffered his first ever off-screen loss out of nowhere, only to then return and actually split the sky with Kaido, which up till now was something reserved for Yonko, and something most of us imagined Luffy was nowhere near capable of doing. Then yet another defeat for Luffy, but this time due to the third-party interference from CP0. And then finally the most shocking ability reveal in all of One Piece, without a doubt, Gear 5th and all the cartoonish craziness that came with it. I'd say in terms of the flow of the battle, Luffy vs. Kaido probably takes the cake for keeping readers on their toes from start to finish. Now in terms of actual choreography, meaning how well the action was drawn, This is of course very subjective, but I personally think Luffy vs Katakuri stands out as the best of the three. Again, this one is probably the most subjective, but I would point to chapter 895 as the main reason I'm giving it to Luffy vs Katakuri, specifically Snake Man vs Katakuri. The movement of action from panel to panel throughout this chapter just felt like the most fluid and clean that Oda has ever drawn, and the emphasis on Snake Man's speed and strange angles of attack clashing with Katakuri's future sight just made this whole sequence a joy to read. Like, it's kind of crazy that one of people's favorite attacks from Snake Man is Black Mamba when it actually never even hit Katakuri. Just getting to see Katakuri dodge every blow was memorable enough on its own. I will say, in terms of pure action, chapter 425 from Luffy vs Lucci and chapter 1042 from Luffy vs Kaido definitely give the Snake Man chapter a run for its money, but I personally still think that the Snake Man chapter against Katakuri is still Oda's finest chapter from a pure action perspective. Beyond that, in terms of overall tone and drama, I consider Luffy vs Lucci as the winner here. From start to finish, I think this was the most deathly serious we've ever seen Luffy for a prolonged period of time, with Oda mainly drawing and portraying Luffy as though this is all or nothing for him. Do or die, giving every single scrap of willpower he has to keep fighting against Lucci panel after panel. And in fact, it's the rare Luffy fight that actually has pretty much zero gags in the entirety of the battle, with maybe just this brief moment of Chibi Luffy cutting the tension. Aside from that, it was pretty much a high-octane, high-tension deathmatch from the first to the last chapter. Luffy vs Katakuri is a close second, with some standout chapters such as 881, featuring Luffy at maybe the most shaken and panicked we've ever seen him during a one-on-one fight. But overall, I'd say Luffy vs Lucci just barely edges it out, simply because the tension and intensity actually increased over the course of the fight, whereas with Katakuri things arguably started to ease up after the initial helplessness and fear that Luffy experienced, especially as we began to see Katakuri as a more honorable figure, things shifting towards more of a sort of respectful duel towards the end, and Oda still included some major gag moments to break the tension. Luffy vs Kaido for the most part was just tonally not as serious as these other two, as for most of the fight Luffy and Kaido were genuinely having fun, and Luffy in particular was mainly portrayed as positive, fearless, and optimistic throughout. Across the entire fight, there aren't really any moments where Luffy is genuinely panicked, stressed, uncertain, shaken, desperate, etc., whereas that was certainly the case for large sections of the previous fights. Then, in terms of at least being serious and driven, for the first 80% of Luffy vs Kaido, there are really very few panels depicting Luffy as particularly serious or driven, and the few panels there are of that are heavily outnumbered by the many panels of him having fun and smiling, and really it's not until very late in the game when Luffy goes Gear 4th that we actually finally get a full chapter where Luffy is portrayed as serious and driven, and even that is of course swiftly undercut by the new, even goofier Luffy in Gear 5th. Now you could argue that since this fight was to set up Luffy as Joy Boy, it was deliberate that he's laughing and smiling so much and isn't portrayed as that serious for most of the fight, but I'm not questioning if this choice was deliberate, I'm just stating my personal preference for the drama and intensity of the other two battles in contrast to Luffy vs Kaido. Obviously, if you prefer a more lighthearted battle with Luffy being all smiles and enjoying himself for the most part, then maybe Luffy vs Kaido sets the best tone out of these three fights for you. On the flip side, this is an aspect that I absolutely commend Luffy vs Kaido for, which is sheer creativity. In comparison, I do think Luffy vs Lucci was overall a fairly creative fight by One Piece's standards up to that point in the story, since in general One Piece featured fairly simple combat before Luffy vs Lucci, and with Luffy's rubber fruit it felt like there were only so many things that he could do. But with the Lucci fight, it was like we had suddenly stepped into that world of Dragon Ball Z, where both characters are now zipping around faster than the eye can see, even basically flying around through the sky at some points, as well as both of them breaking out different transformations over the course of the battle, and even just the variety of Rokushiki techniques that Lucci displayed was pretty cool. On the other hand, while I love the Katakuri battle overall, I do personally agree with a common criticism that a battle between two characters who can see the future wasn't ultimately as creative as it could have been. Because basically, past this panel where it was established that Luffy can now see the future too, it wasn't really referenced that Luffy was seeing the future for the rest of the fight. Like, Oda kind of just established that, okay, Luffy is now also seeing the future, now let's move on to them hitting each other. But really, it doesn't matter, since ultimately, Luffy versus Kaido, with the Gear 5th section specifically, basically blows anything else in One Piece out of the water. And I'd go so far as to say this is conceptually one of the most unique fights you will ever see in any manga ever. I mean, it literally felt like the fabric of the series itself was being warped into a completely different genre, turning the rubber fruit into full-on Toonverse powers, and getting to see Saturday morning cartoons play out in the middle of this epic grand showdown with an Emperor of the Sea. It was just mind-blowing. At the same time, it just felt so perfectly right for Luffy as a character, completely organic as the rightful final evolution of his abilities, something that I elaborate on in this video above my head. Now, there were obviously some split opinions on how Luffy actually got that power-up that I'm just not interested in discussing here. I'm just saying, regardless of how he unlocked the ability, the creativity behind this final section of the fight itself is unmatched in all of One Piece, and is easily my favorite part of Luffy vs. Kaido. And finally, the last thing to discuss is the finish. Here I'll talk about the side of Luffy vs. Kaido that some found to be anticlimactic, Luffy making the big fist to punch Kaido, that then played out over 3 chapters, till he actually did it. I've seen many people say that this section will read better on reread, and I don't know if that's necessarily the case, since I don't think the pacing was necessarily the issue with it. Rather, I think that the way in which it's written inherently makes it more difficult to feel strong emotion over the scene compared to how Oda has written other final blows. By that, I mean that usually when we see Luffy deal the finishing blow to save the nation from the big bad, the backdrop is of everyone, the entire nation, allies, etc., all crying out for help in desperation, putting their faith in Luffy to defeat the big bad. And that provides a lot of emotion behind that final blow, while also creating a resounding sense of triumph as the tension finally breaks, as everyone is able to celebrate in unison as they witness the villain's defeat. However, Kaido's defeat was an extremely solitary affair, with the Alliance unable to watch the fight, and the nation of Wano not even aware a fight is going on, which is why instead Oda had to insert a flashback of Wano to remind the readers that, hey, remember, the people of Wano have suffered. Basically, rather than actually having the suffering people of Wano watching the fight, crying out for Luffy to save them, and waiting with bated breath to see if he can do the impossible, as has been the case in many past finales, instead the people of Wano are actually away having a party, which is why instead we just get this flashback as a kind of awkward replacement for them actually being there and witnessing the fight. The flashback is essentially needed just to even remind the reader that there are some suffering people, and in my opinion, having a flashback to remind the reader that, hey, there are some people out there who have suffered is never going to hit quite as hard as actually just having those suffering people in the scene in the first place. But that's not the main reason it was underwhelming to me personally, and I know to some others. Rather, the main reason was that the final chapter where Luffy actually won the clash, that chapter was actually dominated by a Kaido flashback, which is really strange in my opinion, because whereas a flashback of the people of Wano at least in some way attempts to add emotion to the scene, having a flashback to Kaido really does not, since it's not like we're getting a sad backstory for Kaido. No, this flashback is purely an exposition dump. It's just giving us more information about Kaido. So at the dramatic climax, where the goal is generally maximum emotion, instead we're being fed a bunch more information. Spending a lot of time dumping more information on the reader doesn't really add any emotion to the scene, and if anything, it kind of undercuts any emotion that may have been built from the preceding Wano flashback. So I think no matter how I reread this section, this final blow by Luffy won't personally feel emotional to me, simply because a Kaido flashback dominates this section and it's not an emotional flashback. So for me, it plays out as getting a bunch of trivia about Kaido and then Kaido losing. I would say that's also why Luffy versus Lucci's climax feels so incredibly powerful to me, because it's pretty much the exact opposite. I can go read chapter 427 just in isolation and still get teary-eyed every time, largely because of the extreme emphasis on emotion in this chapter. I could go on and on about Luffy and Usopp's scene, and I actually do in this Enies Lobby analysis, which you can click above my head, but the simplest way to put it is that this is the best take I've ever seen on the shonen idea of power up thanks to friendship. Because despite everything that Luffy and Usopp have been through this arc, the heartbreaking fight they had, the words and blows that they exchanged, at the end of the day, Usopp will always believe in Luffy, and Luffy will always do anything to protect his friends. And so in this moment, Usopp gambles with his life on that belief that Luffy will do anything to protect his friends. And Usopp essentially takes that shonen trope and slams it on the table and says, well, you have to do it now. You need to get up and save me right now or I die. It doesn't matter how beaten or broken you are, you just have to do it. And it works. And in the rawest way possible, Luffy acknowledges Usopp's faith in him and then proceeds to let out all of the pent-up emotion and hardship and suffering that he and his crew have experienced throughout the entire arc on Lucci. And this is of course a series of flashbacks that, in my opinion, are incomparable in terms of emotional weight, as it is all so incredibly personal. It's not Luffy saving a country or a kingdom here. This is all about him and his crew, all the memories of what they have personally fought through for the last 100 chapters, all coming out at once in one cathartic release. This is my personal favorite moment in the entire story. If I were to finally compare it to Luffy defeating Katakuri, well, I'm personally okay with not getting to see the final blow of that Katakuri fight, though I understand those who are upset about that, and I really like the symbolic manner in which Katakuri was finally defeated, as he essentially surrendered the Battle of Wills, but the sheer emotion of Luffy defeating Lucci still makes that my favorite ending to any One Piece fight by a long shot. So all that being said, ultimately what do I consider the best fight in One Piece? Well, many of you may have totally different rankings for each of those categories than me, many of you may weight those categories completely different than I do, and many of you may have different categories that you evaluate fights on entirely. But overall, I'd say for me, personally, Luffy vs. Kaido comes in at a strong third place for favorite fights in the series. Luffy vs. Katakuri is a close second for me, but Luffy vs. Lucci remains my personal favorite fight in all of One Piece. So let me know if you agree or disagree below, and if you enjoyed this video, then you can like and subscribe, and you can get my extended thoughts on this and all future topics on Patreon, link in the description below.